Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. Do you feel you are accurately represented by your chosen political party? If you even have one at all. Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the entire other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, to teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, how to listen and give space, so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans: our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. When I started this podcast, I didn't intend to dive into politics as much as I have. But I found that if you're going to produce a podcast that explores the things that divide us and searches for answers as to how we find common ground, it's a little inevitable that politics keeps coming up. After all, I'd argue that it is at the top of the list of things that divide us, at least here in the United States. It's nearly impossible to hear the word polarization and not immediately think of nasty political feuds. And many point to the fact that we even have political parties as the source of much of our division. So imagine my surprise when, in the course of researching my guest's background for this episode, the organization he is a part of actually takes the stance that polarization isn't always a bad thing. Wait, what? Okay, obviously this needs some major explaining. My guest on this episode is Ellie Zupnik. Ellie is the co-founder of Fix Our House, an organization with a primary focus of getting proportional representation installed in the U.S. House of Representatives. Ellie's colleague and co-founder, Lee Drutman, wrote a book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. In his book, Lee explains that the United States has always had polarized political parties. However, what most don't realize is that up until the last few decades, the U.S. actually operated within a hidden four-party system rather than the Republican-Democrat binary we see and experience today. The parties were still polarized, they just had to find ways to work together more effectively. It's a lot to get into, but this is what Ellie and Lee and Fix Our House want us to get back to: a multi-party democracy where more cooperation takes place because no party owns a dominating majority, and where more people feel represented by their government. Lee actually wrote in The Doom Loop that an anxious pessimism dominates the state of American politics. And that was even written before some of the things that have happened, since then, January 6th onward. Ellie, I'm interested, what do you do to keep focused on the work that you all do with Fix Our House and push that anxious pessimism aside?
That's a great question. I think anyone who looks around at the world right now, who pays attention to politics here in the United States, which is what I pay attention to, but I think around the world, can feel very anxious. Everything feels bad. Everything feels like it's going wrong. Everything feels like it's polarized and toxic and fighting all the time, because it truly is. So what keeps me going is the idea that I think we can do better. We truly can do better in the United States, and I think that there's a path to get there. I look back at our history and I see some very dark moments, from the Revolutionary War to the pre-Civil War era to the early, the World War I, World War II eras, the Progressive era, where there's a ton of corruption in our politics and things look dire. The Civil Rights era, where people thought that no progress would be made and that the civil rights would be just blocked. And every single time, there were moments right when it seemed darkest that things really opened up and began to change. And I think it's those moments in our history, and Lee and others have written about this, Lee Drutman, who my co-founder on Fix Our House, that these moments open up windows for reform that are wider than ever seem imaginable in that moment that you're in when it's so dark. So that's what keeps me going, is the idea that, we really have two paths as a country. We can continue down the path we're on and fall apart or something equivalent, or we can do what we've done before as a country, which is get to a better place, get on a different track, make some structural changes, get to a place where we're moving forward together, where people are able to work together, solve the problems that we have as a country. I think that's very possible. It's not inevitable. It's far from inevitable. It may not even be likely, unfortunately, given the path we're on right now. But if enough people focus on it, if enough people care about it, if they try and do something about it, I truly believe we can get there.
Are there signs that you can point to of things where you say, hey, that is a glimmer of hope. That is something, or there's a group. I mean, obviously the work that you all are doing, which I want to get into with Fix Our House, but are there other things that you can point to right now and say, that gives me hope?
Yeah, I think I think the fact that more Americans than ever are paying attention to our democracy, maybe they're not happy about it, maybe they're paying attention because they're mad about it, but they know something is wrong. Even I would say, what I consider, coming from the left side of the political spectrum to be, a big problem is the fact that there are so many people on the right side in the Trump wing of the Republican Party, for example, who believe that the election was stolen. Even that, I would say, you can look at hopefully is that people are coming around to the idea that our democracy is broken. I don't think it's a good thing, of course, but I think there are more people paying attention to our democracy, more people paying attention to our political dysfunction. There are people out there who are bucking their own party and saying we need results. I think we're seeing now in these January 6th committee hearings, which I know are a contentious topic, but the fact that you have a Republican, Representative Cheney, who is really digging into what has gone wrong in our democracy in the Trump wing of the party, how the Republican Party can be saved from her perspective, from my perspective. I look at that and I see a lot of, in the Fix Our House coalition, we have a number of conservatives, people who are true conservatives who saw themselves as Republicans for many years and who are looking at our politics now and thinking that we need to fix things. There are people who are strong progressives. We have people in our coalition who have been on the left, people in the Working Families Party, people in Democratic Socialists who are standing with these conservatives and saying they too think that things are broken and they too think that our politics right now is not delivering the kind of results that they want. So those are the kind of things that give me hope. And I think that's moving beyond just the inside DC circles of activists, more to people across the country who are, watching these hearings or who are looking what's happening on guns or looking what's happening on climate or immigration, and just whatever side you're on, whatever you think should be done, nothing is happening. So you can't be happy with it. I think that level of awareness of our dysfunction is hopeful, even if it feels really bad now.
Ellie, I feel like that's where I'm at. I grew up identifying as a conservative Republican for many years. I'm from the state of Kansas, so obviously very red state. I don't feel like I have a political home right now. And the work that you and the work that Lee do and write about and talk about, you advocate for political parties and the need for them. There's just not enough. Can you explain, why so many of us feel the way I do, where I don't have a political home, yet there's none to be found?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I agree. More and more people feel like this. When you look at polling, more people identify as independents. They don't identify as Democrats or Republicans than ever before. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, we are a big, diverse country. We are a country of nearly 400 million people. from ranging from people in Berkeley, California to Kansas and everywhere, in New York City to Oklahoma City. There's a lot of difference, diverse. There's a lot of racial, ethnic, religious, ideological, geographic. There are just so many differences, so many different, and that's part of what makes America an incredible place is our diversity of viewpoints, our diversity of opinions, perspectives. All of those have to be jammed into two political parties. That doesn't quite make sense. In fact, I'm a longtime Democrat. I come from Democratic politics. I worked in the Senate for Democrats. I worked on campaigns. It has never made, I consider myself a Democrat. It has never made sense to me that there should only be two choices in the United States. If you are, for example, someone who believes taxes should be lower, but also believes strongly in gun control, there is no home for you. If you are a pro-life person, but you also think that we should dramatically expand healthcare, maybe have a single-payer system, there is no political home for you. That never quite made sense to me. And I think what I learned from Lee Drutman, the political scientist who I mentioned before as my co-founder on Fix Our House, is in the history of the United States, we've never truly had a two-party system. We've had two parties, but there were always multiple strong coalitions or factions within each of those parties. So, for example, you had conservative Democrats in the South pre Civil War to post Civil War, early through the early 1900s. You had conservative Democrats almost through the early 2000s. You had liberal Republicans. You have one or two of those left, Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, but they're dwindling. You used to have significant coalitions that cut across party lines, on ideological lines, on geographic lines, on other lines. Now the parties are fully sorted. If you are a conservative, you are almost certainly a Republican. If you are a liberal or a progressive, you are almost certainly a Democrat. If you live in a city, you are almost certainly a Democrat. If you live in a rural area, you are almost certainly a Republican. There is no more crossover. We are almost fully sorted into two parties that reflect ideology, that reflect geography, and to a great extent reflect identity. People see themselves now as being on two teams. It used to be the case when you had more crossover, when you may live next door to people in a different party, that you would go bowling or you'd go to church or you would go to a community event and your friends would be people who share different perspectives than you do. And you can talk to them and you see them as people. You may disagree with them on politics and maybe sometimes you don't talk about it. Maybe sometimes you do. But you saw them as people. Now our country has been increasingly, and now I think almost fully, divided into two teams, a red team and a blue team. And the parties have gotten so far apart for reasons that we could get into, having to do with primaries and gerrymandering and just the the geographic sorting, that the extremes on both ends dominate the parties, and every election is seen as so high stakes, where if the other team wins, not only is it the case that the policies I care about will be different. That's always been true, although maybe to lesser or greater degrees over the years. It's that everything I believe in will be lost. It seems, when President Trump won, people on the left were devastated. It was terrible. It was the person who reflected the absolute worst from their perspective, from my perspective, was elected. I think the same would have been true for many on the right if Secretary Clinton had won. Maybe the same was true when President Biden won. Every election is so high stakes. Every fight is so so existential and feels so threatening that our politics becomes so toxic.
So, Ellie, this is where my pessimism begins to creep in, and I would love to hear your counter to it. Is all of these moves, all of this deep polarization that you just described, has all been to grab and then keep power. Where is the incentive to let go of a little bit of that I want to get into, to go into, more of a four-party system, more ranked choice voting, more multi-party representation within our political institutions? What is the incentive for folks who already are in power or who are looking at, I have to get power and keep it on either side? What's the incentive to change?
It's a great question. I think a few things. I'll start by saying it may not come from within. It likely will not come from within. It has to come from outside the existing power structure. in terms of pressure that ordinary people, other people who are engaged in politics, people who participate in politics in different ways at different levels, they have to start weighing in and applying pressure and demanding change. I also think external factors could play a role. We saw January 6th, it happened and it caused, it clearly had an impact, but maybe a limited impact. People were able to move on, but there could be more events like that coming down the pike. I don't hope for them, of course. I hope very much that we don't have those things. But I think looking ahead to, for example, the 24 election, whether or not President Trump decides to run again, I think there's a lot of people right now who are ready to believe that the election was stolen, no matter which way it goes. There's circumstances where President Biden, for example, could win the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, but there's maybe electors aren't certified by Republican legislatures. There's circumstances where President Biden wins the popular vote but loses the electoral vote, and the left once again feels like that is not a legitimate election. I think there's a lot of unfortunate, because of the bad place we are in and the trajectory we're on, there's a lot of ways this could go very wrong very fast. Again, I don't hope for that, but that's an external factor that could shake things up and make the DC insiders, make the elites, the political elites, know that they have to change because they're more scared of what happens if they don't change than if they do. And then the other thing I'll say is that I talked to a lot of staffers, when I was working in the Senate, I talked to a lot of elected officials. I saw them talk to each other mostly, and they're not happy. Many of them are not happy with it. I mean, you see there's more retirements than ever. People go to DC that unless you're in leadership or in a perfect position, you're either going to be really on the sidelines, not doing too much, or you have to become essentially a social media star as a way to influence your power, like we see on both the left and the right. People come to DC, and this is something that I think I may have a different perspective on than many people who are more in the reform or critic community. Is I think most of these people in DC do go to DC for good reason. The people I knew, sure, there were some people who were corrupt in different ways, harder to be corrupt these days than before, but still possible. There were some people who were just jerks or cared about the power, but a lot of people I saw, including Republicans, I dealt mostly on the Democratic side, but many of the Republicans we worked with, they did care about solving problems. They did go to DC because they cared about an issue. Maybe it was something I didn't agree with. Maybe it was something that they cared about. About gun rights, First Amendment rights, or they cared about abortion and life issues. Whatever it was, people came to DC because they wanted to do something. There's lots of other things you could do in this country if you just want to make money or get power. And sure, again, I'm not saying there aren't bad politicians and bad staffers, but I think a lot of them are very frustrated with what they've seen, where nothing gets done, where there's absolute gridlock. The things they promised their constituents when they campaigned, they can't deliver on, and they just have to make excuses for. People feel bad. And I know this is something that Lee has said all the time. He talks to lots of senators and congressmen who reach out to him, who've heard him talk about the dysfunction, want to know what he thinks. And he says all of them come to him saying, I came to DC to get things done. This is broken. What are we doing here? Why do we keep doing this? And they want to fix it. So I think there's especially in the younger levels, because if you look at Congress, there's a lot of older people at the top in the leadership levels, and there's a lot of younger people who are hungry for change on both the left and the right, and absolutely in the middle, who want change, who want to get things done. And I think a combination of the older generation shifting out, the younger generation shifting in, and some external events and things just continuing to be bad is going to push us, I hope, toward that reform moment.
Something you mentioned a little while ago that I want to come back to, especially as it relates to those younger members of whether it be Congress or legislature or just those staffers, what have you, the standing up for and breaking away from the party line. How important is it for folks who lean left to recognize damaging far left ideology on the same side as people who lean right to recognize and call out and distance themselves from far right ideologies? How important is it for, and how do, I guess I'm asking two questions, how important is it, and how do these young staffers who see these extremes dominating, I think, a lot of our thought process, a lot of the media headlines, how do they break away and call out the extremes of both parties to bring us back to, a somewhat where we can compromise in some way?
It's a great question. I think that question highlights exactly what is wrong with our politics today. Because if you are a center-left person, for example, or a center-right person, and you see someone on the extreme wing of on the far left or the far right say something that you think is damaging, you have a choice. You can attack them and try to shut them up, but that will mean that your side could have a greater chance of losing, and that because our parties, like we talked about before, are so sorted and the two sides are so different from each other, there's a strong incentive to stick with your team and focus on the other team because the other side winning would be so catastrophic for each side. Now, what I think would help this is if we broke up the two teams and we didn't make it so that it was a pure binary, because then someone on the center would feel perfectly fine criticizing someone on the left because their votes could come to the center if they make a persuasive enough case. Same thing on the right. I talked to a number of people on the center right now, conservative, never Trump Republican types who desperately want to find a way to be able to express their values, their priorities, what they consider to be more the true conservative values, who have no way of doing it now in the current Republican Party. So their only choice is, do they attack the people on the right, or do they try to, or do they? That's it. Like they really, they have no other option. And what we want to do is give everyone the ability to have pathways to power for the things they believe in, to be able to actually have to persuade people that your side is right. If you are on the far left and you want to make the case for democratic socialism in America, you should be able to do that. You're not a Democrat. It's not the same thing as being a Democrat. It's not the same thing as what President Biden is doing every single day. He's not a socialist. But every time Democratic Socialists, for example, and this is something they would say, I'm not saying anything that they wouldn't say. Yeah. When they speak, they get put in that same bucket. They have to differentiate themselves from President Biden. They have to, this is something that Representative Ocasio-Cortez said. She said, in no other country in the world would I be in the same party as President Biden. And I think that reflects a really important truth. And same thing on the center right. You have people out there like Cheney, Representative Cheney, Kinzinger, and then other former members of the Trump administration like Miles Taylor, who's on our advisory board, who just don't see themselves as being in the same party as the Trump wing, but have no other path in our current system. So they are, they have nowhere to go, nothing to do. And the only thing that they can do, and I think that many of them are doing this, is to advocate for reforms that would change that.
Yeah, I think you tweeted out recently, Joe Manchin and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are in the same party as are Liz Cheney and Donald Trump. That makes zero sense.
That's right. It truly makes no sense. And again, in most other democracies, most other advanced democracies in the world, they wouldn't be. They would form a coalition where that makes sense on issues they agreed on. They would form a coalition with others where that made sense, but they wouldn't have to pretend to be in the same party with all of the downsides that come from that.
So is it going to take an independent winning to somehow, or a couple of independents winning high-level races to somehow split things up to where people can gravitate towards people who have an actual seat at the table? Is that some of that groundswell or that outsider push that you talked about earlier?
I think that would help. And there are a number of efforts across the country to support candidates who would support reforms. Senator Murkowski in Alaska, there's Final Five voting up there. She's a moderate Republican, one of the few left. If she wins, it will be because of a coalition of Republicans in the center and center right and Democrats. And that's the only path she has to beating maybe the the Trump Republican that's going to have a pretty strong showing in their open primary. I think there's efforts across the country to expand fusion balloting, which is something that you have in states like New York, where you could put a single candidate on multiple lines. So a candidate could run as a Democrat and also a member of the Working Families Party, for example, or Libertarian Party, for example. That strengthens parties and strengthens the ability for people to join third parties without being spoilers. There's efforts like ranked choice voting, which are efforts that I think don't always go as far as we need to go, but that at least move us away from the status quo where you could have someone win reflecting a tiny, tiny minority of the district. These are good efforts, and I think when independents win, it's not, I would say independents winning in and of itself may not be everything, but independents winning who come from a place where they understand that we need reform, who want to strengthen third and fourth party movements, who want to shake things up. It's a lot of people who are in the reform movement come at it from a very moderate position, and that's good. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being pretty much in the middle. I think a lot of things in the country work when there's movement that comes from the middle. But I think what would really help are for reforms that allow, sure, the middle to exist, because right now it can't at all, and sure, the middle to be powerful, but also for people on different extremes, different ideologies, who have different opinions, to have legitimate homes, political homes, where they can advocate for the things they care about. Because there's a lot of things in our country and a lot of things generally that start off on the fringe, but actually make sense. And you need to have, I think, a political discourse and a political culture that allows for people to have fringe opinions, to advocate for them peacefully and legitimately, and to make their case for them, and to use political tactics that are legitimate to pressure for them, to make deals, to try to get their priorities into pieces of legislation. That's what a healthy political culture looks like. It's so far from where we are now, but it's a place where I think we could get to.
We've alluded to it kind of the entire time, but you're not advocating for you're actually advocating for more political parties, not that the parties come together and just simply agree on more, because Lee writes in the book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, polarization actually is in some ways a good thing. Political parties are a good thing. They help define issues for us because we don't have all the information, so we rely on a lot of parties to do that. You're not advocating that parties go away. You're advocating for more so that there is more accurate representation. Am I characterizing that correctly, Ellie?
That's exactly right. We have legitimate differences in this country. Again, we said at the top, this is a country of nearly 400 million people. There are big differences ranging from, should the top tax rate be 28% or 32 or 40? Should we have abortion be legal in this country, or should it be done at a state level? Should we have, what are the gun control laws? Some people believe, we should have pretty close to none. Some people believe we should have pretty close to no guns. And there's a whole lot of space in between. We have a legitimate differences of opinion. And that's what you should have in a healthy democracy, in a healthy representative democracy with a lot of important issues at stake. So what I think would be healthy, instead of, I don't think it's realistic to say everyone in the country should just agree, or we should only do things where we could get, big consensus agreements. Sure, there's a lot of things that we should be able to get consensus on. Some of them we see right now that still aren't getting done. Things like background checks for guns that have 90% support but still can't get through. A lot of climate change efforts, policies, if you look at the polling, has 80+%, and it's only the special interests that are stopping them from getting done. But most issues, you're not going to get that kind of consensus. And we have a democracy not to work on the things that we agree on. The things we agree on are easy. We have a democracy to work on the things that we disagree on, to find peaceful ways to have a big, diverse, in our case, multiracial, diverse country where we can have legitimate differences and a process for adjudicating and moving forward without coming to violence or separating or thinking that the other side is an enemy, which is sadly where we are and where we're headed toward now. So I think parties do help. What I've seen over my time working in politics is, when you have strong parties, and of course, strong parties can go wrong. And I think the two-party system exacerbates a lot of what can go wrong. But when you have strong parties that help, that pull voters in, that educate voters, that help them understand where candidates are, that that organize year in and year out, not just for the election cycles. That works better than when you have a system where it's candidates divorced from parties, where it's often, unfortunately, the wealthiest candidates only who can do that, who can self-fund, who can get their name on the ballot, who don't necessarily, it's harder for voters often to understand exactly where they stand because they don't have the party identification to really, help them see, and hold them accountable on policy issues. It doesn't really work in terms of like creating a community and a culture. I mean, you look at some of these wealthy politicians, some of them have been perfectly good, some of them less so, but when they leave, they don't leave anything behind. You look at Mayor Bloomberg in New York, or you look at others who have run across the country who are wealthy politicians. That's what parties do. So I think there is absolutely value in parties. It's helpful in a democracy. I buy that case from Lee and many other political scientists. I just think the two-party system is what the problem is, and we need more parties, not fewer parties or no parties.
All right. So how do we get there? Let's spend some time talking about how we actually get there, and let's throw some optimism at this, Eli or Ellie. You mentioned earlier the ranked choice voting. You kind of intimated that it was a good solution, not a great solution. Can you walk me through what ranked choice voting entails and your thoughts on it?
Sure. So ranked choice voting, right now we have what's called a first past the post electoral system, where you have a number of candidates on the ballot. Whoever wins the most, if they win one more than the second place person, they win everything. And that means that a candidate can win, if there's, let's say, 3 people running, a candidate could win with 35% of the vote and have 70% of the people, or 36% of the vote, and have 69% of the people vote against them, vote for someone else, and still win as long as the other two are getting 34 and 34 or 34 and 33. So what we see across the country is that we have lots of elections that are won by people who are not supported by the majority of people in their district, city, or state. What ranked choice voting would do is it would take the kind of system we have now, where you only vote for one person and you have to choose your favorite person. And a lot of people will sometimes vote strategically, because if you're, let's say, a Green Party member, a libertarian, you need to vote for the person. You can't vote for your candidate because that just you may be a spoiler, and you may throw it to the candidate you like even less. But what ranked choice voting would do is, instead of voting for one candidate, you rank the candidates. So if there's 3 people running, you say, who's your top choice? That's number 1. Who's your second choice? That's number 2. Who's your third choice? That's number 3. And then the way they count the votes is they do the tabulation like they would normally. And if someone has over 50%, if they were able to get a majority, that it's over. They've won. But if nobody cracks 50%, what they do is they take the person who got the most low rankings, the lowest rankings, the fewest top votes, and they eliminate them. And then they take all of the votes that this person got. Let's say it was a Green Party candidate. Democrat got 40%, a Republican got 30%, and a Green Party candidate got 20%. They would eliminate the Green Party candidate, and anyone who voted for them as their top choice, it would go down to their second choice. And let's say that Green Party candidate voted, of the people who voted for the Green Party candidate, 70% of them voted for Democrats, or 80% voted for the Democrat, 20% voted for the Republican. That would then put the Democrat, in this example, over 50%. So what this does is it eliminates the spoiler effect. Nobody is a spoiler. You could vote for your heart. You could vote for your actual political priorities in that first round. If you're a Green Party member, if you're Libertarian, Working Families Party, Democratic Socialists, whatever you are, you can vote for that candidate first. Or if you're just a Democrat who in a primary, for example, and you want to vote for one person, but know that they're probably not going to win, but you want them to show some strength, and then your second choice can be the person who you actually want to win if your first choice doesn't win. So it's much more reflective and responsive of the majority. It helps push toward moderation, because instead of, for example, in 2016, many people thought that Trump can secure 30 to 40% and had that locked in, and then the rest was kind of divided among 7 or 8 other Republican candidates, from Jeb Bush to Rubio to
Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz, yes,
yeah.
exactly. So if there was ranked choice voting, maybe President Trump still would have won. But if it was the case that the majority of Republicans wanted anyone but Trump, which many people were saying at the time, he would not have won, and the will of the electorate would have been better reflected. So I think that it is absolutely an improvement on the status quo. It makes the political system healthier. It gives people more options, but I don't think it goes all the way to where we need to go, and we could talk about that too.
Yeah, I definitely want to go there, but it just is so striking to me how you put that. You can win just barely, even a third of the vote and still become the candidate because you still got more. And so 70% of the people that you are charged with representing didn't want you in office. That is so striking to me, Ellie, that is how, for the most part, we choose our candidates and elect.
It's even worse than that, unfortunately. I mean, what you just laid out is exactly right. What makes it even worse right now is that we have a system where many elections are won or lost in the primary because it is either a very strongly Democratic area or a very strong Republican area. So you can have a district, let's say, where 20% of the district votes in the Democratic primary. It's a 70% Democratic district. So of that 20% who are voting in the primary, let's say 7% vote for one candidate, that person wins the plurality. That means you have a candidate who's going to win the general election who was only supported by 2.5% of the overall electorate at the time that it actually mattered. So we have an absolute crisis of representation. I think ranked choice voting moves us a step in the right direction.
It's exacerbated by the fact that here in Colorado, where I live, I believe, I can't remember the exact numbers, but a ton of money from the left and on the Democrat side went into far right Republican campaigns to prop them up because they thought they would be better in the general election. And it's like, okay, well, what happens then in a scenario where they actually perhaps do win office? It just is this zero sum game that just you take a step back and it's like, what are we doing here, folks? What are we doing here? Do you ever get that? I'm assuming you get that frustrated with it too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a real structural problem. I mean, sure, you can look at what those groups are doing to prop up far right candidates and think that that's a dangerous game. I agree. I think it's a dangerous game to play. I think it's our democracy is in such crisis right now that it's too dangerous. Mm-hmm. But you also look at the system we have, and it is set up to make those kind of things advantageous. The incentives are aligned so that Democrats know if they can set up the least electable Republican, they have a better shot at winning. But if we didn't just have two parties, then anything they did to help that MAGA Republican would just, wouldn't necessarily go to them. It could flow to other people. It could flow to the center-right candidate. It could flow to others. Having it be zero sum creates these wild incentives where, I mean, like exactly as you said, where Democratic groups across the country are propping up far-right members because they think they have a better chance of beating them. And if they don't, then it's, you have more Representative Boeberts and more Marjorie Taylor Greens and more people who are very much on the extreme right.
So why then because I love ranked choice voting. I was reading about it and hearing you describe it, I really like it. What are the drawbacks that you see?
I actually don't see drawbacks. I just don't think it goes far enough. I think that ranked choice voting is often discussed in terms of single winner ranked choice voting. So it's for a mayor, it's for a single winner district, it's for a governor, it's for a senator, like we see in this top five with ranked choice voting in Alaska. It's what we saw in Maine with Senator Collins winning using ranked choice voting last cycle. What I think needs to happen to go a step beyond that is to make it multi-member and proportional. Not for executive positions, that's much more difficult when you're talking about mayors or governors or president, but for legislative positions, for the House, to make it so that you are not just voting for one member using a ranked ballot, but that you are voting for multiple members, and multiple members can win in proportion to the number of votes that they get. So instead of having a single district where maybe it's 60% Republican, and 40% Democrat. So as long as the Republican the Republican would win that district and they would get one representative, and 40% of the people would be essentially unrepresented, you have 5 members in a much larger district. And let's say that same larger district is 60% Republican, 40% Democrat, to keep it simple, or we could talk about it with multiple parties too. But then what would happen is the Republicans would get 3 seats in that 5-member district, reflecting the 60% of the vote that they got. Democrats would get 2 seats, reflecting the 40% that they got. So everyone would be represented in proportion to the numbers that they actually have. That's a much fairer system. It really breaks up this idea that you have a red America and a blue America. I mean, Kansas is a great example. You mentioned that you're from Kansas, or you lived in Kansas for a while. Kansas is considered a deep red state, but close to 40% of the state voted for Joe Biden. That is, like, people, pundits in DC and politicians even, and certainly when it's discussed, people think we are a deeply divided red and blue country. But Republicans, there are more votes for Donald Trump in California than there were in most of the rest of the country, because California has a ton of Republicans. They have more Democrats, but they have a ton of Republicans. The reality is that we are a much less, we are a sorted partisan. We are sorted when it comes to partisanship, but there are things that we can do to give voice to the people in different states who are in the minority, ideologically, racially, ethnic groups. There's a lot of cases where people are unable to get any representation because they're never going to crack that plurality in the district, but absolutely could have representation if we move to a multi-member proportional system, which is what we're advocating for.
Ellie, I love it. Like, here I am. I mentioned earlier, I'm a slightly right-leaning independent. You're a Democrat. We're agreeing on this. We've found common ground. My gosh, how the heck did we get this done? How did we get it done? Because I love this. Sign me on board. I know. Tell us about the work that you're doing with Fix Our House and the efforts that you're doing to get this in more elections across the country.
Yeah. So first and foremost, we're trying to spread the word. This is an idea that not many Americans have heard about. I mean, one of the things about America and politics is people assume that the way things are now are just the way they have to be. The single winner system in America is like the water we swim in. You don't even notice it. It's not something that people even think is up for debate. But so the first thing we need to do is help people see it doesn't have to be this way. This is something that the parties in power and all of the way the system works pushes toward it and doesn't question it. But people need to begin to question it and start to realize that there's a better way of doing things, that it doesn't have to be this way. Because as soon as we tell people about this, most of the people we talk to are like you. They say, "Oh, this makes sense. Why don't we do it?" So just getting that conversation going more, which has become easier and easier. I think maybe 10 years ago, this was a much tougher conversation to have because maybe more people thought things were going okay. Now most people see that things are absolutely broken, that things are not just going to get better on their own. So we're trying to educate as many people as we can about the doom loop as a major problem, the fact that the two-party system is causing so much of these problems. There's lots of theories out there. Some people blame social media. I think that plays a role. Some people blame individuals like President Trump. If he didn't exist, everything would be okay. I think that I don't think those are exactly right. I think the reality is we have a system that is set up to fail. The two-party system is set up to have the other side be demonized, to have every election be high stakes, to mask over many of the differences and diversity that we have as a country, and having people see that and then start to tell their friends about it and start to talk to their lawmakers about it and have it be so that if there is a moment when a window for reform opens, maybe it's after the next unfortunately, hopefully not, but maybe this is after the next moment of political violence, or maybe it's after a contested election in 2024 or 2028, or maybe it's after there's just been so many years of gridlock and dysfunction that people across the country are just sick of it. We want them to know that there is an alternative. And when the moment is right, we want them to advocate for it. We want them to push and pressure their elected officials and make it so that we make this change. And I think it's something that, we see, the way when we talk to lawmakers, when we talk to staff, we describe this change as a change that they can make that may be the least disruptive, most impactful change you can make to American politics, where it's not going to absolutely upend our political system, doesn't require a constitutional change, doesn't require massive changes except consolidating existing districts into larger districts. People wouldn't notice much difference at the start. You'd still go to your voting booth, you'd vote for more candidates, but some people already do that across the country when it comes to their city council races or state legislative races. But you would start to see a big difference in the culture. You would start to see a big shift away from this two-party doom loop that we're in, and a move toward additional parties forming that reflect people's values, that can form different coalitions on different issues. More moderates would be empowered to run for office who now think they have no chance. I think you'd start to see a real shift. Wouldn't solve everything. Democracy is messy. You still have a Senate that still wouldn't be changed by this, because the Senate you'd require a constitutional amendment to make it into a multi-member system. But it would be a big change. It would move things in the right direction. So I think that that was a long answer to your question, but the basic idea is people need to learn about it, tell their friends about it, start to talk to their lawmakers about it, and we at Fix Our House are trying to arm people with the information, understanding, and ultimately the tools they need to do that.
And that's interesting. You advocate. This is for you're advocating for a change in the way we elect representatives to the House of Representatives. I believe you also talk about then there would be a need to expand the House of Representatives from its 435 members right now, correct?
Most people who talk about multi-member proportional representation also talk about expanding the House. It makes it much easier. For example, a state like Wyoming that only has one member in the House delegation, or North Dakota, and South Dakota, or even states that have two members, it's harder to, of course, with one member, you can't have a multi-member district. With two members, it's hard. With three members, it's hard. You really want to have 4 or 5 members in a multi-member district. So the way to do that is to expand the House, to make it so that states like Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota, and, smaller states with 2 or 3 members, whether it's Rhode Island or it's Montana, have more members, and the power doesn't change. It remains proportional. California would still have, 50 to 1 because it reflects the population, but it would just be more members. Now, Fix Our House isn't focused on that initially. It's something that Lee thinks is a good idea. I personally think is a good idea. It's something that most people who support multi-member districts support. But we want to talk first and foremost about the idea of proportionality. That's a good idea. We think that would come along with it, but it is more important for people to understand that the two-party doom loop is the problem, and that breaking that up requires proportionality in multi-member districts.
So is the kind of call to action then to contact state legislators? Would this change happen individually at the state level?
So what we need a law at the federal level. We don't need a constitutional change, but there was a law in 1967 that banned multi-member districts, that made it so that states are only allowed to have single winner districts. The reason that happened was because some states in the South, Southern Democratic states, were abusing their right to make their own district lines, to make essentially block districts, to ensure that Democrats, if they won one more vote than the Republicans in a southern state, would win all of the state's congressional delegation, similar to what the Electoral College is now. So there were states in the South that were abusing that to keep Republicans and African-American voters disenfranchised at that time. So that's why it was banned in 67. It's a very different situation right now. It is. So, our call to action right now is first and foremost, share with your friends, spread the word. We need more people to know about this. We need more people to understand this. We need to build a movement of people who are committed to reform, who believe in that the country can do better, that we could get to a better place, and that we're not consigned to constant fighting, toxicity, and an ever escalating doom loop. So that's our first ask, is for people to spread the word. Share the stories that we're sending out, that we're pushing around. Tell people to go to fixourhouse.org. Share our social media. We're going to be creating more content, more explanatory work, and then ultimately we're going to want people to advocate to their lawmakers at the federal level, but then also in their states, to put pressure on federal lawmakers to there's legislation currently in Congress. It's called the Fair Representation Act. It's a big bill that would set very specific ways of moving to proportional representation. But if that's not something that a person can support, we're going to be working on other paths. Whether it's just a straight repeal of the 67 ban that would allow states to make decisions about this, or something slightly different. Those are some of the legislative pieces we're working on. But first and foremost, we want this initial period to be mostly about spreading the word, building the base, creating this community of people who are committed to this kind of reform, because we think that can go a long way.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Ellie, what is a question that you wish you were asked more about all this, or what have you? I'll leave it open and vague, but what's a question you wish you were asked more?
That's a great question. I think that's a really good question. I think that the thing that I like to talk about more, the thing that what I often when I get asked to talk about these issues, it's with people who, like you, are very interested in democracy reform and who are very interested in the structure and the process and the incentives. What I would love to talk about more, and what we're trying to do more, is to really help connect the dots between these democracy issues and the issues that maybe people think about more every single day. Maybe it's the average person in the country, or maybe even the highly engaged political person isn't necessarily thinking every single day about democracy, even though I think they are more and more. They're thinking about inflation. They're thinking about healthcare. They're thinking about maybe gun safety because of a recent shooting, or they're thinking about maybe it's abortion or choice issues because of the Supreme Court ruling. What we want to do, or the climate. A lot of people in the country right now are thinking about climate, young people especially, but more and more generally, that transcends the political spectrum. People just care. They see what's happening with the climate, and they don't want to leave that kind of country and world to their children and grandchildren. So what I want to talk about more, and I think what we're trying to talk about more, is connecting the dots between those issues that are day-to-day issues that people care a lot about, and the broken system we have and what we can do to change that. So it's not about reform for reform's sake, although a lot of people who think about this every day care about reform for reform's sake. I don't think that's what most people think about. I think most people care about specific issues. They care about their family. They care about their community. They care about their country. So connecting the dots between the things that people care about and are on top of their minds and maybe vote on every single day, and these structural issues and the reforms that we advocate. So, for example, we want it to be that if you care about the climate, if that's your top issue, for example, you would put pressure on your representative to support proportional representation, because you know that that's the only way we could ever make progress on the climate. Because under our current system, you have one side that's always going to be pushing back against any kind of change because they don't want to give the other side a win. If you care about the First Amendment, for example, to use an issue outside of my side, if you care about the First Amendment, and that's the thing that is what you are most focused on, maybe right now things are going well for you because of the current Supreme Court, but that may not always be the case, and you may want to have a system that works where you can actually be represented. And the list goes on and on. Whatever issue you care about, if you're not seeing progress on that issue, immigration, gun safety, healthcare, if you think that there still needs to be more work to be done, taxes, the economy, the list goes on and on. There's no issue right now where real good bipartisan or cross-ideological or certainly not multi-partisan work is going on. That would change, and that could change, and new coalitions can form, and things could get done on so many of the issues. And that's the thing that we want to talk a whole lot more about.
And I would be remiss if I didn't remind people that we've been here before. It wasn't explicitly outlined as America had four parties. And I think you even kind of alluded to this earlier, but in the mid 1900s, is that even the right word to say? In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, we had kind of what's a hidden four-party system. And you had far left, center right, far right. And it was just a time of much more, not consensus building, because I think at this point that's kind of not possible, but a lot of cooperation, a lot more compromise, a lot more getting a lot of really big things done and tackling a lot of the big issues that you just mentioned could be done. So we've been here before. We can certainly get there again, can't we?
I think that's right. I mean, you look at President Johnson passing the Civil Rights Act with a mix of Republican and Democratic votes and pushing aside the anti-civil rights, racist Democrats in his own coalition or in his own party. You look at President Nixon passing the Clean Water Act with a mix of Democrats and Republicans. That was possible because, like you said, we had these hidden four-party system. We did not have a true two-party system. That's what we need to get back to, a place where coalitions can form, where it's not one side versus the other, where you can have different cuts and different splits. And there's multiple dimensions to politics, not just are you red or are you blue? Are you on one side or are you on the other? And unfortunately, the things that allowed that to happen before, some of them, fortunately, don't exist anymore. I mean, a lot of the reasons that it was happened, a lot of the cause of what we saw in, the post-Civil War to the Civil Rights era was because of, racism and race issues in America that cut the parties in different directions. Of course, the progress we made on that front is good. But the reality is that we have now fully sorted into a two-party system. We don't have those same cuts anymore. Like you said, like you mentioned before, there was a mix of, you had many more moderates, you had many more liberal Republicans, you had many more conservative Democrats. I mean, when I came to the Senate in 2009, I was there for 10 years from 2009 to 2019. In the beginning, in the Senate, Democrats had 60 votes, but many of those were very conservative Democrats. Ben Nelson from Nebraska, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut. There were, the Senate Majority Leader right before then was Senator Daschle from South Dakota, who, was not, he was moderate to conservative. There was a big contingent of conservative Democrats, and I think it petered out a little bit earlier, but in the past there was a large contingent of Northeast, pretty moderate to liberal Republicans that have slowly but surely faded away with a few exceptions. So those don't exist anymore. So we need to make a change to our structure that can allow for more parties and more perspectives, because that hasn't gone away. It's just cut in different ways that the current system don't allow to truly be reflected.
Well, Ellie, I will link up fixourhouse.org for anyone who wants to, as you said, just educate themselves more, learn more about this. I so appreciate you coming on here and talking about it and educating me on a lot of this stuff. Is there anything you felt I should have asked about, or you would have liked me to ask about? Anything you came in here wanting to make sure we discussed before we wrap things up?
No, I think we covered it all. I appreciate you
Wonderful.
Paying attention to these issues. I appreciate you paying attention to the problems in our politics, but then also that there are solutions. I mean, it's very easy to be despondent, to be pessimistic, and there's a lot to be despondent and pessimistic about. But the choice really is, do we just consign ourselves to this continued dysfunction and toxicity, or do we want to get things better? And I appreciate you paying attention to the kind of things that could help get us to a better place.
Wonderful. Well, I hope everyone listening does the same thing. So, Ellie, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, sir. Best wishes to you.
Thank you. You too.
Huge thank you to Ellie Zupnik for sharing his perspective and wisdom and story on the show this episode. Please do me and Ellie and Fix Our House a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to this conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and digging a little bit deeper. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Ellie Zupnik that I have on the show each and every episode, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you would ever like to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.